on the similar theme around hyper-awareness, emotional intelligence, this next panel is really interesting. I think it highlights the approach that we're taking to sales confidence as an organization, but also from the perspective of SaaS growth today, about how do you think differently and where is the value in that? I'm really excited that we've actually got Dr. Helen Taylor today from the University of Cambridge. So she has been deeply involved in the emergence of social complexity. And she's here to publish a new theory of human origins, the evolution of complementary cognition. This explains how we evolved with different and complementary ways of processing information together as a system. She's been featured on BBC 4. Just back recently, only a couple of months ago, she was actually presenting to the royal family in Sweden, several who are dyslexic. And she's also recently given a keynote lecture at the V&A Museum on Dyslexia and Creativity. And we're really going to bring that home by bringing in Chris Tottman from Notion VC, who opened up the event last year. This is an individual who essentially left a working class background and over 16 years built multiple businesses at greater than 1 billion valuation, and now has spent the last 10 years investing in many of the companies in the room. So there's some significant value to be shared. As part of thinking about the key aspect of how do you actually leverage this knowledge you're going to share, you've got to find the right people. So Sophie, Rason from Ingenio, essentially they are focused on identifying top talent, top sales talent to drive your organization's growth. And they've been successful in delivering candidates to typically pre-IPO businesses out there. And then finally, 2017's VP of the Year, Pete Crosby, who also opened the event last year and who's very keen on this topic, joins the panel. Now, all of this has been pulled together with a lot of dedication, and we've already opened up earlier about why the content is upped this year, and that's very much because of Lauren Cartigny's contribution. She's going to be curating this panel, and she's built some expertise over the last couple of years around consciousness and overperformance of leadership. So this is some really interesting insights. I'm looking forward to hearing more. Thank you, guys.
Great, thank you. So firstly, for me, it's an absolute privilege to have been able to speak to these four wonderful people and understand their personal perspective and also Helen's research in a lot more detail. Generally feel humbled to be here right now. So I'm going to do my best to do them justice. I'm going to speak the least possible because neurodiversity, when I tried to prepare, I asked Helen, can you help me define what does neurodiversity mean? How do I launch the subject? And she said, actually, hang on, the person that coined the definition in 1900s is staying in my flat this weekend, so I'll ask her if you like. So this is just to give you an idea of the tone of the conversation we're talking about here, right? So the experts are in the room. So neurodiversity, as Judith Singer introduced it in the beginning of 1900s, about describing a new type of, at the time called a disability, right? An autistic spectrum is what they would refer to it as a social context. There's a different way of interaction in society was starting to be defined, and that's kind of the terms that would be allocated to that. So what does it really mean? So really, she proposed that there was different ways of thinking, and that actually they were based around random evolution of humankind. So at the time, she would effectively describe this as there was different ways of thinking, and she's the first person that started to move the conversation away from like mental, medical condition to a different way of thinking, right? So we've been working on this for quite a while, and I think it's only now that really this is something that we can talk about in the workplace. So Helen's developed an actual theory that challenges that, and it's not just about the random evolution of how our brains are wired, but it's actually to do with humankind evolving to adapt to a faster pace of living, climate conditions. I mean, I'm going to let her explain, but it's really fascinating about her research is basically saying it's not random. We're evolving as humankind, and therefore our brains are evolving, and therefore we have different ways of thinking. So I'm going to let Helen, explain why she studied this. Like, what's her personal reason as to why invest so much effort in this research, her personal journey, and also give you some sort of sneak preview of her research, because we could talk about it for quite a while. So I will let Helen please help us understand why you became interested in this topic and what gave you that perseverance to really go into that much detail to connect all these dots for us.
So I guess what really drove the research was my own sort of personal experience through education. So I really struggled, especially with reading and writing. I almost failed pretty much all of my degrees, was on the verge of being chucked out. But then in the end, when I managed to get my ideas down, was winning awards and scholarships. So it made me start to really kind of question whether this was really a disability. And I realized that the way that I think is very visual. I make a lot of connections between things. I understand things in systems, and that's just very difficult to translate to writing. So I started to think maybe people just think in different ways. Maybe we've actually specialized to think in different ways that work together. And so I started looking at economic theory a lot, because obviously if you specialize and collaborate, then it increases productivity. So I basically developed a new theory of human evolution that we've specialized in different ways of thinking that work together as a system. And I sort of worked out how that would have evolved, why, and what we actually specialized in, and I've made a number of predictions which over the past many years I've been researching have turned out to be correct. So basically what I think has happened that in our evolutionary past, before the origin of our species really, at a certain point in order to survive we had to, in the kind of environment that we evolved in, we had to process information in a way that was beyond the capacity of a single brain, so that the only way to survive was to specialize in different ways of thinking and cooperate. And the problem with the education system nowadays is that it really favors some ways of thinking more than others, and so then you get a lot of people who have diagnosed with developmental disorders like dyslexia or ADHD, and just other people who just struggle and think there's something, just think they're stupid basically, when they're actually perfectly fine. And this is a really big problem for business, because the reason we evolved these different ways of thinking is because it actually increases individual and group productivity. So if you're cutting some of those different ways of thinking out of your business, maybe through biased recruitment practices, for example, then you're actually diminishing the productivity of your business. And so, for example, if you cut out people with things like dyslexia or ADHD, you'd actually diminish your ability to adapt to change in the long term. And you also see this pattern in leadership teams. So I've been interviewing dyslexic CEOs, for example, and they'll tend to be really amazing at the kind of long-term vision. They're very good at predicting market trends, often really ahead of the curve, and good at innovating strategies to move forward. But they really need to work with people who are much better on the operations side of things, the detail organisation, project management, for example. And so it's just really important that you have these different ways of thinking working, different complementary ways of thinking working together to increase team productivity.
Great, well, thank you. I think we're going to try and understand, different points of view. So, I mean, for Chris, for you, I know dyslexia is, is close to your heart. So, can you help us understand a little bit more about your own, how this resonates with you personally, and also, in the businesses that you've built?
Yeah, thanks. Are there any dyslexic people that are in the room? I know there's one sitting next to me. There's probably quite a few. So I think 80% of people that are dyslexic have never been tested. So that probably means there's 4 times as many dyslexics in the room. I'm not dyslexic. I'm probably borderline dyslexic. And what that means is there's things that you can measure that might imply that you're under this umbrella term of dyslexia. So my eldest son is borderline. He's borderline because he has a huge deficiency in one of the measures, which is short-term memory recall, which is what people think I've got. And I think about that if you're sort of blind, then you've probably got great hearing, or if you're deaf, you've probably got good eyes. And so it sort of, when we talk about it, it means that it's compensated somewhere else. So in our role at Notion, I think Chasho mentioned earlier, we have this kind of proprietary data set that measures the difference between companies that raise a Series A that go on to become a unicorn and those that don't. So we try to look at sort of the statistical analysis of what is it that they're doing that's different. And so what's really interesting is the unicorns, they just operate differently when they think about the way that they do recruitment. And so they have a statistically significant, like 5 times as many people from a top 100 university than non-unicorns. But the one that's even more greater than that is that they also hire people that have no university degree at all, which would be somebody like myself, for example. So there are these very interesting ways that they think about talent. And the best way that I think about it is that they're not following a cookie cut. They're not following a norm. They're not thinking this is the model that works. They're constantly challenging. They're constantly curious. They're constantly thinking about innovative ways to do something different. So we're trying to figure it out, because effectively our future as an investor is in finding outliers, and so we constantly are looking at ways of how are things invented, how do things scale fundamentally different and faster than anything else, and we're having to look for different ways to measure that. I think when I talk about founders specifically, particularly creationist founders who create things that have sort of not really happened before, rather than entrepreneurs who might join a business at a later stage and make it a very big company, and they are an entrepreneur, but they aren't necessarily the ones that created that company. You know, we really notice that what they do is when they have an idea that the world should work differently, and they become quite obsessive about that, and then they, you know, switch off a lot of their life to focus on that thing, and they gather other people to go on that journey, and they're good founders. And the great founders are actually a little bit different. What they do is they realize that the original idea was relatively basic and wasn't fully fledged and hadn't been market tested, and they find that the thing in the market, there's something that really needs to be solved, and they focus the whole business around what needs to be solved, and they're highly iterative around the way that they think about solving that problem increasingly in different ways. And so we think about them being, you know, extremely agile mentally, extremely curious. It's the same thing. It's about really testing those the norms, the firm beliefs that individuals or markets might have about how a market should operate. And ultimately what they will go on and do is they will completely reinvent that market. They will completely reinvent that market if they're going to build a massive, massive company. And so, you know, for me, you know, it's amazing to sit on stage with Helen. She's one of the most important subject matter experts that I have. You know, and it's you know, the trying to really understand this sort of dark space called neurodiversity for me is, you know, is a fascinating thing. So.
I can see it touches you. So I think, you know, thank you for that personal and business insight. I think we're going to take it now more from a recruitment perspective. So, I mean, you know, how does this help, you know, you as sales leaders to hire people, and how does that impact recruitment companies, right? Because both parties need to be involved to start addressing this and making more creative minds available in the first place, right, in the top of the funnel of hiring. So Sophie, you know, can you maybe give us a perspective from a recruitment perspective of what this means, you know, in your world?
Yeah, so we've all heard about the challenge that everyone has with finding talent, and now we have to think about millennials and neurodiversity, and there's a lot to take in. And what we do is we work really closely with our clients to understand what it is that specific business needs, whether it's seed stage, Series A, B, C. The people you had yesterday won't be the same people you need today and that you need tomorrow. Do you need an entrepreneur who's perhaps created their own business, whether it was successful, whether it wasn't, but that real risk taker? Do you need an athlete, as was mentioned earlier, someone who knows how to win, how to lose, how to be resilient and, you know, rile everybody up? Do you need the more traditional academic profile, someone who's come from a red brick university, gone up the traditional sales route and is perhaps a safer pair of hands? There are so many different types of people that could be within the business, but how do you identify those? They don't come on your CV. You won't necessarily have people that are forthcoming with having dyslexia, or may not, as you mentioned, even know that perhaps they do have it. So we need to think about the things that people have the traits they have that aren't on your CV, that aren't part of your professional experience. What are people's passions? What achievements have they had? How can they demonstrate thinking outside of the box? And we work with our clients to devise questions, perhaps just put them on the spot at the end of a call. We have an AI and automation company that are building out an innovation team. They need people to be thinking outside the box. They need different types of people that can give a different edge. So we ask, if you had a superpower, what would it be and why? So many people might think, oh, I could see into the future, I could read people's minds. You may not get the job because that's probably not out of the box enough. We had a candidate who was talking about fluorokinesis, which is the ability to, I think it came from a film, I don't even know, the ability to perhaps create agriculture through a superpower and to have urban farms that can solve the hunger issue and so that people know where their next meal is coming from and that they can provide. That would be something that might be out of the box. But every single company has different needs, different types of people, and it's about understanding your business and finding the gaps in your organisation and not necessarily looking into those traditional boxes and having a mix of people. Perhaps you want the academic, you want the former founder of their own business, you want the athlete, you want the hunter, you want the master relationship builder. But we've found that having a mix of those has made a really successful team.
Thanks for that, Sophie. That's brilliant. I think that really resonates, right, with what you're saying. Effectively, you're just continuing the story. So, Pete, maybe can you add to this in terms of your perspective and how this impacts? I know you're really passionate about mental wellness in the workplace. So, how do you bring this, into how you lead your teams and how does that impact people?
Yeah, sure. The biggest challenge that we've found is that most leaders and companies tend to hire in their own image. So we can all think of companies that will only hire Oxbridge graduates who look a little bit like them. And what sits behind that is three things that need to be developed from a hiring point of view and from a leadership point of view. And the first of those is self-awareness, which was already mentioned earlier. If you don't have a self-aware leadership team, then you will only hire for your bias. If you only hire for your bias, you'll only cover off about 1/4 of the leadership skills that you require and 1/4 of the skills that you require across the business. So we're actively hiring for unusual, quirky, slightly odd individuals who are less likely to be hired in other places because we know for sure that they will unlock in sales, in marketing, in the creative parts of our business, they will unlock things that other members of the team cannot unlock. And so we need to make sure that we create that. And the way that we do that is through authenticity. So we've built a program called the authentication process. And nobody gets hired who has not gone through this successfully and passed it. And the authentication process is designed to unlock their values and understand, based on targeted questions, where their values lie. It doesn't matter about their neurodiversity at all. What matters is understanding how they think about the world. And so, for example, we hired a woman who specifically in meetings admits and struggled at first to admit that she thinks in colours and finds it very difficult to translate those colours back into the kind of logical thought processes that a more traditional workforce might have. And yet she's one of our most successful people because we've been able to unlock that. So firstly, self-awareness. Secondly, authentication. And the third area is safety. There's a very well-known Harvard Business Review study that shows that when CEOs around the world are asked what is the thing that you most have to do in your organisation, the top result answered number one by 70% of people is safety, providing a safe space for people to operate in. And that's a very, very hard thing to do. So if you can create a safe space with authentic individuals, if you have a self-aware leadership team who are able to unlock that potential, then you attract people. And so just very quickly, I remember in one of my previous startups, I chaired our diversity committee. And someone on that team, a young gay man, said, I almost didn't join because I couldn't see anyone here who looked like me. I didn't even know what a young gay man looked like, but he obviously did. Right. And he almost didn't join. And so he joined because he was a pioneer. So therefore, we have to create policies and make it very upfront that we have those policies so that people will follow, and you end up with a much more diverse workforce.
So they can recognise themselves in your organisation, not be the first one, right?
Exactly.
So I think that what's coming to mind right now is how is that relevant in a hypergrowth environment? And I think in a hypergrowth environment, you need to be adaptable to change. So when you're hiring people, and I think that's when the dots connected for me when Helen was saying that. People will have these creative minds that are a little bit more, a bit odd and have their own ways of doing things, will be better adapting to change because they've had to adapt to change from day one because society, the way other people think, isn't the same. So they have this natural way of being able to adapt to change really quickly anyway. And I think you add adapting to change as one thing, and then growth mindset, like Angie and Martin talked about. Having growth mindset is great, right? However, it doesn't mean you need to go and hit your head against the wall every time and be okay with that. I think a safe environment is absolutely key, right? Because in that safe environment, what is it? It's actually, fail fast, fine. But, you don't want to have to hurt yourself doing it either. So I think, helping to coach leaders on how do you provide a safe environment? What is a safe environment? A safe environment, in my eyes, is very much around allowing people to feel not judged for trying new things and for, seeing leaders be vulnerable and sharing their vulnerability. And I think, Helen, I know we've talked about this, but can you tell us a little bit more around that aspect of things, of like how can leaders in the room actually take away some of this and say, oh, how can I be more vulnerable in the workplace? How can I show the example to my team so that people can highlight their strengths, but also what their weaknesses are? Because if you don't know what your weaknesses are in your team, you don't know how to compensate them, right, with other different people. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that, and what advice would you give people in the room?
I think it's really important for leaders to be self-aware of their strengths and weaknesses. There's actually been research to show that the best leaders will tend to be excellent in one or two domains of leadership, but very weak in other areas. But what they're good at is finding complementary people to work around them. But of course, in order to build teams like that, you often need to be open about your weaknesses. You need to be vulnerable. And a lot of I interviewed quite a few dyslexic CEOs, and one of the things that they said was once they were more open, it really helped them to connect with their staff. So there was a quite nice story from John Chambers. He was the CEO of Cisco. And he'd actually been very secretive about the fact that he was dyslexic. And he was at a huge Cisco conference with all of the staff. And they had some of the children of the staff members come up on stage to ask questions. And there was one little girl, and she went to ask her question, but she just broke down in tears. And he took her off stage, and he said, what's wrong? And she said, I'm dyslexic, and I couldn't find my words. And he said, I'm dyslexic too. And he said, it's really a gift. And he walked her through the question and went back on stage. And at that moment, he realized that he'd left his mic on and disclosed to the entire company on stage. And he said to me, he said, I was pretty sure that I'd said too much. He said, I thought Cisco wanted someone that was superhuman and that could lead the company into battle against our biggest competitors with no fear. He said, I thought they wanted somebody with no weaknesses, but he said I was wrong. He said after that, he says so many people got in touch with me and said, you know what, John, we saw a different side of you today, and it really helped us connect with you, and I'm dyslexic, or I've got friends who've got other issues, and he said it just made him a better leader to show that side of him. And I think if leaders can kind of be vulnerable and show their weaknesses, then it, kind of like what you were saying, it creates that more psychologically safe environment for your staff to do the same. And sort of going back to the theory, if we've evolved to think in complementary ways, we need to be self-aware of our strengths and weaknesses and find those complementary people to work with in order to sort of be more productive as a business, but also to increase sort of well-being as well. So, and also the added bonus of having a psychological safety in your team is actually, studies have also shown that teams then tend to perform better and are more adaptable to change. So it's a sort of win-win situation.
Wow, thank you. I think, I think I'd like to sort of open it, to you all really, to sort of what, we've got about sort of 8 minutes to share around, what do we make of this, right? Because there's a lot. This is a month's worth of actually preparation to try and concise in 3 minutes each what could be of most value to you. So I think I'd like to use the rest of the time, to kind of see what you make of this conversation, what you'd like to part with the audience, because the idea is really much to serve you and to inspire you to walk away and actually think, vulnerability is a strength. So how can you create vulnerability as a leader and show the example, right? And then how, as an individual contributor, not to be scared of being vulnerable, making mistakes. And if you're in the right company, that will be praised and that will be encouraged. And if you're not in the right company, it won't be, and you should find another job. So I think if we can use the rest of that time to try and just see what's with you and what you'd like to leave with our audience, I think that would probably be the most valuable. So who wants to start? I know you've got lots of ideas.
I can start. I think one of the unusual things, the Notion founding team have been together for quite a long time, so maybe 20 years. And so when people join at a senior level, they find there's one thing that we do that they find a little bit uncomfortable. And so we do strategic offsites about 3 times a year, and one of those might be as long as a week. And we might spend the whole day, and the agenda item for the whole day is like, how do you feel? And so as you get older, you come to understand that everybody's got their own issues and everyone's got their own life situations that are bringing issues to them. And some of those issues might actually be you or in the company that you're in, if you see what I mean, not to do with your children or however you're trying to reconcile your challenges that you've got going on. And so if you're a new person to that, that's actually quite a frightening thought process to spend all day talking to these new people about how do you feel. And so we're aware that it can be quite an undertaking. But of course, what happens when you think about vulnerability and safe space is they'll witness these quite big personality types talking very openly about the things that they're going through. People will be going through issues where their children are extremely ill. They'll be going through divorce. And these are things that we will have discussed at length over the last 20 years. And so after a while, they may then start to open up and start to really understand that this actually is a very rich emotional environment that's very supportive. And so it's one of the ways that we're able to, develop ourselves as individuals and develop our own, if you like, collective courage to be honest with each other and to hold people to account, but also to allow other people in because they see the way that we care for each other, the way that we prioritize about the fact that they should probably be spending more time out of the office than in the office and so on and so forth. And so, that's just one of the practical things that we do. And as I said, we have offsites about 3 times a year. Some of them are quite long, but it's a very, very powerful session. I can't imagine us doing an offsite without that happening.
Around the feeling side of things. Do you have people animating that for you, or is it just you internally? Do you have someone externally facilitating that for you?
It's just us. Yeah.
Great, because I think to have that maturity to be able to do that is one thing, but to take little baby steps, right? Not everyone's going to be able to ask their leadership team to go off-site and talk about their feelings. So I think, coaching is one of the things that can also help with that in terms of you experiencing what that is. And Ollie Sharp this morning for Sales Off was talking about the physical, emotional, mind and spiritual side of things. And I think, there's a lot of science now around, your physical health, a lot around the mindset, the brain, neuroscience. Spiritual doesn't really, today's and purpose, I guess, is where we talk about it in the business. However, emotional well-being today in the workplace is something that managers know I need to be doing something about it. Emotional intelligence, but what tools do they have? What tools do they have, and what tools can we give managers to better understand themselves so they can then better relate to others, to be more vulnerable, right? It starts with that. So what's been your experience of opening up? I know you do a lot of work with this, with Pete, in your team.
Yeah, well, we run 4 quarterly courses for each member of our team, and the 4th of those is the most important, and that is a mental wellness and elite performance program. And the reason I link those 2 things together is because elite performance, the ability to be up at 5 in the morning, running a 10-second 100 meters, to do that kind of activity over and over again is incredibly mentally draining, and you cannot expect to have high performance from people without there being some debt accrued. And so the reason for having that mental wellness course is for people to understand, what does elite performance look like in my role, when it's okay to say, I've had enough and I need to step away, and what are the tools I need to build true mental resilience. And so we want to encourage people to open up for 2 reasons. The first is that we know that at least 1 in 4 people in the workplace will have some kind of mental health issue. Yet I guarantee that a very few of them in most of our workplaces have not spoken about those things for the reasons that some other members of the panel have already mentioned. And they won't speak about them, and I'll give you a really good example. I had a Slack from someone the other day to say, I have a cold, I won't be coming into work today. I also had a Slack from someone else saying they weren't coming in today. And I knew exactly why they weren't coming in, but they didn't feel able to say that it was a mental health issue. And the reason they didn't feel able to say it was because it just felt like weakness. And the only way to change that perception is for the leadership team to create those kind of courses and that kind of vulnerable attitude that allows it to be okay. There is now a big study by McKinsey that demonstrates that a diverse workforce adds to the bottom line. You don't even need to have an emotional response to this. You can have a business response to this if you would prefer to do so. And so the course that we do assumes that salespeople in particular are more likely to have a mental health issue than the rest of the workforce on average, because we all know that these are up and down individuals who are under consistent pressure. Frequently you're activating cortisol. When you activate cortisol, you activate fight, flight or freeze reflexes.
Absolutely.
When you activate those reflexes, people get into a state which is difficult to retreat from. Weekend is often not enough to deal with it, and then you have the end of the month, you have the end of the quarter, you have all sorts of pressures. So it is incumbent on us to put safe spaces in place to tell people, this is how you deal with it. This is how you raise the subject internally without fear of losing your job or being seen to be weak. And this is how you speak about this. And the only way, in my view, to achieve that is to start at the very top. So just as Chris explained, we do exactly the same thing, but we do another thing, which is we have 5 values, and once a quarter, the senior management team meet to discuss one of those values. It's a 4-hour meeting. It begins with a mindfulness session, and it begins with explaining where we are emotionally, and then we align ourselves on those values so that when we're talking to the rest of the company, we're speaking with one voice. And if we're leading that team like that, then it means I can lead my sales leadership team like that, because I have permission to do that. And that means my sales managers have permission to do that as well.
And I think that's the permission is the most important, to allow vulnerability within your teams. That permission of being vulnerable is taking away judgment. Emotions, there's no right, there's no wrong in emotion. Your emotion is real and it's true to you. So I think when we're talking about vulnerability, and I guess coaching does help with facilitating how to express those things, but actually it's speaking your truth and know that there's no right or wrong answer. How you feel is valid, right? It's valid. So safe environment equals there's no judgment as to whether it's right or wrong. And just that, getting your head around that when we've been brought up, right, in society, and work tells us all the time it's right or wrong to feel that way, is not easy, right? So these are a great example for, thank you for sharing those. Sophie, would you like to add something as well on that for the audience?
Yeah, I think obviously it's important to know your culture internally. Every single person in your business should know the values. If you had an interviewee in the lobby and they asked someone from your business, they should be very clear about the company, the vision, the values. But then you also need to make sure that message is clear to the market. And when you're interviewing candidates, that needs to be clear in the process as well, how that candidate experience is, how they're treated, how they're questioned, to have that real kind of human interaction as well. That just needs to be quite apparent from the outset, I'd say. So how you might go about doing that, when you want to understand people's traits, some people may do some sort of online personality test, some people might see that as dated, and perhaps not a forward-thinking company. What kind of line of questioning are you going to be asking these individuals? How are they going to demonstrate that? And again, coming back to that safe environment, even through the interview process. So it's an important internal and external message to attract the right people.
Absolutely, and I think having Dr. Helen Taylor here helps us, have the ammunition, the science behind it that's proving this, right? Because the physical and the mindset stuff, the neuroscience has helped us with that, science has helped us with that, but the understanding the emotional side of things, because we're all different, our emotions are valid and they're all different. I think, having theories, around mind, how our brains work, etc., and you validating that helps give permission, right, to businesses to invest in this. So just thank you for having persevered through your own personal story. I mean, when you think about it, right, I mean, I get really downtrodden when I talk about it, and actually it's happening right now. But you actually persevered for the good of the world, because you knew you'd connected something, you didn't know how to say it, how to write it, and it was really made difficult for you. And you persevered to get your message out, to get your having your studies published, so that actually people in this room can actually have the piece of paper and the scientific fact to actually make this something actionable within the business. So thank you, Helen, for this, and thank you all for this panel.